Hello, at 1,000 subscribers, I will make a special series of stories for you. At high noon, Dry Creek smelled like a stove that never cooled. Heat lifted the tar from the wagon wheels, lacquered the clabbered fronts, and drew a thin blue haze from the saloon door where matches died by the dozen. Even before you saw the sun-baked sign Dry Creek, Pup 413, you could smell it. Singed oak, fried grease, overworked horses, and the constant ghost of tobacco. Folks said they could taste it on the wind 10 miles out, as if the whole town were one long exhale. Inside, the Bluebonnet Saloon, springs in the piano thumped along under a song everybody knew and nobody listened to. Card-slapped table felt in quick, annoyed rhythms. May, the owner, moved through the room like a thunderhead, refilling sour mash and swatting at hands that strayed where they shouldn't, when her eyes cut to the man seated beneath the mirror polished. Boots up, hat tipped back, the air around her seemed to step aside and give him room. Clayton Reeves. Cattle money and consequence. A streak of silver on his belt buckle, another on the band of his hat, and a third that glinted whenever he turned his wrist to light a cigar. He didn't smoke to calm his nerves. He smoked to remind the room he didn't have any. Another. Round, Mr. Reeves? May asked, voice even. Clayton rolled the cigar between his fingers before answering, feeling its weight like a promise. Not for me. For the boys in Morley's crew. They close on my herd tomorrow, and I prefer my buyers hydrated. A banker from 2 towns over-raised his glass in thanks. The poker table looked up when Clayton spoke, and remembered their cards. We're losing, and looked back down. Sheriff Amos Pike stood just inside the doorway, half in shadow where the light couldn't quite reach around him. His badge was bright, his boots were not. A man who'd done hard things without glory and learned to let his silence do most of the talking. He watched Clayton with the steady attention a man gives a skittish horse or a strange dog. Not fear, not exactly, but respect tinged with caution. Reeves, the sheriff said by way of greeting. Sheriff, Clayton replied, pinching a flake of tobacco off his tongue and smiling like it was a joke they both understood. Outside, the heat leaned against the town with both hands. A freight wagon rattled past, throwing dust up in sheets. The blacksmith hammered iron at a tempo that set dogs howling once every hour like clockwork. In the narrow slot of shade beside the church, 3 children divvied a biscuit and argued about whose turn it was to pretend they could taste butter. No one in Dry Creek starved so obviously that someone had to intervene. They starved in the little empty spaces. Everyone had learned to ignore. Clayton struck a match on his boot heel. The flare threw a warm seam across his jaw, and for a breath. He looked young, a ranch boy trying on a man's shadow. The smoke came easy. He caught May watching and lifted his hand in apology, but didn't put it out. He rarely did. He stood, rolling his shoulders as if the ceiling were too low for his height, and walked for the swinging doors with the lazy stride of a man who owned more horizon than he could see. The piano stumbled, then found the tune again. Someone laughed too loudly. The room pretended not to notice him leave. Clayton stepped into the white glare, and the town's heat climbed onto him like a second coat. His eyes adjusted, and what he saw first was the dust hanging, falling, feathering his boots. Then he saw her. She stood by the water trough, a narrow strip of shade falling over her like a ribbon that didn't quite reach her ankles. Patches on her dress were neat, in a way that said the hands doing the stitching cared about lines, even when thread was scarce. Her hair had the stubborn resilience of a scrub bush after a hard winter. But it was the eyes that set him back, clear and steady as a well you didn't expect to be deep. You dropped that, she said, and pointed. Clayton looked down. A cigar he'd tapped at the threshold had flown in a bright arc, landed not a foot from her bare toes, and was still burning a small, determined coal. He could have lifted it with 2 fingers, pinched it dead against his palm like tough men. Did to prove something. He could have ground it out with his heel without bending. Instead, for a breath, he did nothing at all. Got a lot of town here, little miss, he said finally, motioning with his chin at all the dirt in the world. Plenty of places for one stub to land. Plenty of places, she agreed, not moving. But it landed by me. Her voice had no quaver in it. Clayton had heard 1,000 kinds of talk. The snide lilt of men who had more coin than they'd earned. The sly wheedle of players hoping to buy time. The stammer of boys carrying guns they weren't ready to use. He'd heard Defiance Hell. He'd inspired it, but this wasn't that. This was a statement placed on the ground like a stone, plain and heavy. You got a name? He asked, which was as close as he came to apology. Her chin lifted 1 notch. Eliza May. Family around? He meant it like a courtesy. It sounded like an inventory. No. The word fell between them and didn't break. Across the street, the barber froze mid-shave, razor glinting by a customer's ear. 2 porch sitters stopped their chairs in precise unison, as if choreography had been rehearsed in secret. The blacksmiths. Hammer hovered and came down light. Dry Creek, which could ignore a lot, knew how to mark a moment when it walked out into the sun and demanded to be counted. Clayton glanced at the sheriff, who had stepped to the saloon door, but hadn't come through it. Amos Pike leaned the way men lean before they move, weight half forward, hand on the frame, eyes holding both the door and the street. Miss May, Clayton said, if that smoke offends you, I can. Eliza's gaze flicked from the ember to his face. She cut in quick, not sharp but fast, like the edge of a letter knife. Are you going to put out the cigarette on me? The sentence landed wrong in the ear on purpose. He understood that. It made the question bigger than the stub in the dust. It asked about the town and the way it looked away. It asked about what men like Clayton did when the world made room for them simply by stepping aside. He felt, absurdly, an urge to laugh like. A man laughs when he trips on a rug in front of a room and pretends it was a dance step. But the laugh, if it had ever been there, burned away on the next draw. Smoke clung inside his mouth, dry and metallic. The ember by her foot pulsed, then dimmed, then pulsed again, fighting to stay a thing. No, he said, and for a heartbeat it was just a word, flat on a plate. Then he felt what it had to carry, and he made it heavier. No, I'm not. He flicked the ash from his cigar and crouched enough to pinch the fallen stub between thumb and forefinger, heat biting his skin. He ground it smooth and stood. Sweet tar smell fading from inside the saloon. The piano stumbled again and recovered. The barber finished his stroke. Someone laughed, this time softer. The town exhaled. You got shoes? Clayton asked, looking at her feet because he needed something sensible to do with his eyes. Had some, she said. They got taken off me when I slept. Traded some weevily flour for these patches instead. She twisted her skirt to show the neat cross stitches, as if to say, I don't like the terms either, but look what I made of them. Who took them? Amos Pike's voice traveled easily without raising. People said the sheriff could make his words carry like a tin cup passed. Down a line of men at a pump lane, serviceable, reaching every hand that needed it. Eliza didn't answer the sheriff. She watched Clayton the way a person watches a stray dog approach a child, ready to move, but also curious if something gentler might happen. Clayton felt the weight of eyes behind curtains and between fingers on half-open doors. He was used to carrying other people's attention like it was a pocket watch, a useful tool, a measure of power. Today it felt more like a chain around his ankle. May, he called over his shoulder without turning. You've got that bread left from last night? May's reply was immediate, iron on velvet. I've got bread. I don't hand it out from the threshold like feed. Clayton nodded as if he'd expected that, and began to turn his cigar in his fingers again, a habit as involuntary as breathing. He didn't light it. How much for the loaf? He asked. May stepped forward into the light, flour still dusting the knuckles of the hand she braced on the door. 2 bits. Clayton fished $1 from his vest and laid it on the rail. Keep the change. He said it the easy way, but the sheriff's eyebrow lifted a fraction, and Clayton felt that, too. How the town kept count, not just of coins, but of gestures. May's face didn't soften. Hospitality in Dry Creek was a ledger, not a feeling. Still, she turned and vanished into the cool behind her, and returned with a heel and a half wrapped in paper stiff as bark. She held it toward Eliza, not out to the empty air, and Eliza took it like a person takes a thing she has earned, even if the accounting was murky. Say thank you, May said. It wasn't a command to a child. It was a reminder to the town. Thank you, Eliza said to May, then to Clayton, separately, as if refusing to let either be absorbed into the other. A horse snorted hard from the post to their left, stamping and jangling its tack. The animal rolled its eye white at the smell of sulfur as Clayton, out of habit, struck another match and touched it to the cigar that hung unlit at his lip. Eliza flinched. Not dramatically. Not for the crowd. Emotion was small and complete, like a door bolted from the inside. The match's light, for that brief flare orange, quick painted her face and showed him a map he hadn't wanted to see. Old fear, new defiance, a road between the two walked too many times. He blew the match out and did not light the cigar. Behind him, someone muttered to someone else about men who didn't finish what they started. Clayton didn't turn to see who. He felt the sheriff's eyes on that unlit end, like a judgment suspended, and found he had no argument to offer it. You. Working, Eliza May? Amos asked, shifting the weight of the question, so it didn't sound like an accusation. When folk pay, I do, she replied. Chores, messages. I watered Mrs. Dorsey's lemon tree last week, and it looks less sad. I can mend, too. She stroked the straight line of stitches again, pride precise as the thread. You bed down where? Amos asked, same steady cadence. Behind the church when there ain't service, she said quick. Behind the livery when there is. The admission lit a fuse in the crowd that didn't quite reach flame. Some winced in sympathy. Others turned their faces away. Guilty reflex. Clayton thought of the big empty bunkhouse at his north pasture, of beds that waited like dogs at a door. He flicked his thumbnail against the cigar's band and peeled it, then felt foolish for having made a mess of the paper when the ground was already dirty enough. You can carry water, Clayton said, the line forming in his mind before he let it out of his mouth. My boys can always use another pair of hands at the pump. It's honest work. The last 2 words sounded like he was repeating something he'd once been told and hadn't liked at the time. That Eliza chewed the inside of her cheek, thinking, how much? $1 for the day, he said, without calculating. It was too much by town standards, not enough by his. Murmurs rose and fell like a breeze catching shirts on a line. He felt the sheriff's gaze, again measuring, not condemning. May's face didn't flicker. Eliza looked at the bread then, at the cigar between his fingers, then at the $1 on the rail where May had left it instead of pocketing. I'll take half day, she decided. Bread now, work after. And you don't drop burning things at my feet. Not on purpose. Not. Careless. Her eyes held his. Not at all. Clayton met that look, and for the first time since stepping into the glare, felt heat he couldn't blame on the sun. He dropped the cigar into the water trough without ceremony. It hit with a small hiss that drew more satisfaction than it had any right to, and sank. Amos, who had been a hand at cattle before he was a badge, let his mouth show the ghost of approval. "Then that's settled," he said to the street, which was the same as saying it to the town. The blacksmith's hammer found its beat again. The barber called for his next customer. The Bluebonnet's piano caught a new tune that sounded enough like the old one to pass as change. People moved their chairs. Curtains fell. The hinge of the day unlocked and swung forward. Clayton nodded once to Eliza. "Meet me by the north gate at 2, he said. "You keep your bread in the shade till then." He almost added a softer line, something about salt or water, but the words didn't fit in his mouth, and he let them go. Eliza tucked the parcel under her arm like a book, and, for a moment, looked not at him but past him, at the long street. The mountains scored faint in the distance, the thread of the creek that ran just below the lip of town, and pretended it gave the place its name. When she looked back, the decision was set. "I'll be there," she said. Clayton tipped his hat. Not the flourish he used on buyers, not the mockery he offered men who'd challenged him at poker. A simple downward cut of the brim dot as he turned back toward the saloon to settle his tab and whatever else the day required. Amos caught his sleeve gently, not in warning, not in threat. "Reeves," the sheriff said low. "Be sure you mean the things you just did in the sun." Clayton met the sheriff's eyes, and in them found nothing but a scale and a willingness to use it. "I mean what I can," he said, which was true for the first time in longer than he wanted to count. "We'll see about the rest." He pushed through the swinging doors, and the smell of stale smoke met him like an old habit. He paused on the threshold, and with a small curl of his lip that only he knew was a wince, let the door fall wider so the hot, clean air of the street edged into the room. Cards lifted in hands. May's brow rose the length of a match head. He laid another dollar on the bar for the bread and the breeze both. Eliza stepped off the packed middle of the street to the rougher edge where weeds gathered their courage. Two boys under the church eaves stared, then pretended they weren't. She lifted the bread just enough to let them see, tore off a corner, and handed it over without pausing her stride. "Don't fight about it," she said. They did anyway, but quieter than usual. The town resumed. But under the hum of work and want, something had shifted tiny as an ember crushed into dirt, impossible to account for in a ledger, and yet they're all the same. Dry Creek still smelled like smoke, but for the first time in a long while, a thread of cooler air pulled through it, thin and stubborn. By 2 o'clock, the sun would still be merciless. The pump would creak, the north gate would cast its sliver of shade, and a man who lit cigars to prove he could would be standing there, empty-handed, waiting to see if the girl with the steady eyes kept her word. The desert did not forgive, but it did remember. Nights in Dry Creek were quieter than any city man could stand, yet not silent. Coyotes cried from the ridges. Wind slid down the canyon walls, dragging grit against shutters and doors. Horses stamped, uneasy at shadows they could not see. The stars were so many, they pressed down heavy, like lanterns hung too low. Clayton Reeves lay awake in his ranch house, cigar smoke curling into the rafters, keeping him company the way a faithful but bitter friend might. He had a habit of leaving lamps burning, afraid of the dark in ways he never spoke of. Wealth bought him fine rugs, whiskey, and silverware imported from the East, but it hadn't bought him a night's easy sleep in 20 years. The girl Eliza May. Her name had cut into him that afternoon like a spur digging too deep. And her words, "Are you going to put out the cigarette on me?" He had replayed them a dozen times, each repetition heavier, until it was not her voice, but his brother's he heard. He shut his eyes, and the years unrolled. The barn. Fire Clayton was 13 again, in a barn that smelled of hay and horse sweat. His younger brother, Samuel, only 9, had been chasing chickens with the careless glee that came from knowing an older brother watched the gate, Clayton had been given one job: tend the lantern. Their father always warned, never leave fire near straw. But when Clayton heard the neighbors calling for him to bring out the pony, his pony, the one his father had given him for his birthday, he rushed outside, lantern forgotten dot by the time. He led the animal back. Smoke was pushing through the slats. Samuel's shouts cut through the crackling, high-pitched, panicked. Clayton dropped the reins, tried to run in, but heat slapped him back, and a wall of flame roared up as if it had been waiting for his return. Men came running, buckets in hand. But it was too late. The roof caved, and Samuel's cries ended in a soundless flash of orange. For years afterward, Clayton could still smell the smoke in his clothes, even after his mother scrubbed them raw. He carried that smell into manhood, into business, into every deal sealed with a match and a flame. Smoking cigars wasn't just habit. It was punishment and reminder. Each puff whispered, "You left the lantern burning." The town's whisper. Day after Eliza stood against him, Clayton tried to bury the memory with drink. The Bluebonnet Saloon welcomed him as it always did. Cards were shuffled, glasses filled, dice rattled. But as he sat at his favored table, he noticed the way conversation bent around him. Two men at the bar whispered just loud enough. That orphan girl, tough little thing. Stared Reeves down like he was no more than a farmhand. Maybe the smoke's finally choking him. May, polishing glasses behind the bar, caught Clayton's eye. She wasn't afraid of him, not May. She'd buried a husband to fever, raised 2 boys, who now drove cattle for other men. She knew the measure of wealth and what it could not buy. "You see her much?" Clayton asked, his tone rough. May didn't blink. "She sleeps where she can, eats what she finds. Works hard when folks let her. You know her folks burned, don't you? Burned?" Clayton repeated, though the word felt like a stone he already carried. "Cabin fire," May said simply. "Her ma and pa inside. She was 6. Neighbors pulled her out through a window. Since then she's been nobody's child but her own." Clayton's throat tightened. Fire again. Always fire. The smell, the smoke, the helplessness. He stared at the glowing end of his cigar until his vision blurred. A visit from the sheriff that night. As Clayton rode back to his ranch, Sheriff Amos Pike waited for him at the gate. The sheriff leaned against the post like he had all the time. In the world, though the tilt of his hat said he had something worth saying. "You ever notice," Amos began, "how some folks carry matches, but others carry scars?" Clayton pulled his horse to a stop. "What's your meaning, Sheriff?" "My meaning is that girl's seen fire before. The kind that doesn't go out when you stop it. The kind that eats everything." Amos's eyes fixed on Clayton's cigar. "So maybe when she asked you about putting out your smoke, it wasn't the stub she meant." Clayton's hand trembled as he lifted the cigar, though he hoped the sheriff didn't see. "She's a child. She doesn't understand men's ways. Or maybe she understands too well," Amos said. "She's seen what fire can do. She's seen what men can do." He straightened, brushing dust from his coat. "And she saw you. Maybe for the first time, you didn't much like what she saw." Without waiting for a reply, the sheriff tipped his hat and walked off, boots crunching the gravel, leaving Clayton with the night and his ghosts. Clayton's restless night's sleep refused him. He paced the halls of his ranch house, each polished. Portrait on the wall, a reminder of wealth stacked high on cattle herds, rail contracts, and land deeds. Yet none of them could silence Samuel's scream in his memory, or Eliza's question in the street, dot in the mirror above his washstand. He studied his reflection. Lines cut deep, eyes bloodshot, a man who had fought to build an empire yet couldn't. Stand against the judgment of a ragged orphan. The cigar stub still burned in his ashtray. He crushed it hard, sparks spitting. For a brief moment, He thought he smelled burning straw instead of tobacco. He staggered back, fists pressed to his temples. The girl was fire, he thought. Not a flame to fear, but a flame to face. And maybe, just maybe, if he stood close enough, she could burn away the guilt he had carried since the night Samuel died. But guilt was stubborn. It clung like smoke in a man's lungs, and it never really left. Morning in Dry Creek came with a thin chill that never lasted long. The desert air cut sharp at first light, only to soften into the usual dry furnace by noon. At the Bluebonnet Saloon, men shook dice cups and argued over whose luck had soured. Overnight, at the Livery, horses twitched their tails against flies that seemed to multiply with the heat. The blacksmith's hammer rang before breakfast and kept its rhythm steady as a church bell. Eliza May rose from her pallet behind the church, brushing dust from her patched dress. She tucked her bread parcel close, tearing only small pieces so it would last the day. By 2, she had carried buckets at the Reeves Ranch until her arms ached, careful to show no weakness, even as the men watched her with sideways glances. Some laughed at the sight of a barefoot girl doing men's work. Others said nothing, for they had seen the way Clayton himself stood by the pump, silent but watchful. She did not thank him. Gratitude was dangerous when it could bind you to someone who might turn cruel later. She only nodded when her day's $50 dropped into her palm, and she left. But fate never let her walk far without testing her. The drifter Buck Hanlon had ridden into town a week earlier, a man with dust in his beard and violence in his grin. Folks said he'd once run with a gang down along the Rio Grande, then double-crossed them. He lived now on suspicion, quick hands, and the kind of laughter that made even poker players uneasy. That afternoon, Buck caught Eliza with the street, narrowed between the mercantile and the feed store. She had slipped her hand into his wagon, fingers curling around a hard crust of bread he'd left on the seat. Hunger sometimes overruled pride. He grabbed her wrist before she could run, spinning her so fast the crust fell into the dirt. "Thief," he spat, dragging her into the open. "Little rat trying to rob me blind." Eliza tried to jerk free. "It was only bread." "That's mine," Buck growled, lifting his hand as though to strike. "You think you can steal and walk away whole." A crowd gathered quick. Dry Creek loved a scene. Storekeepers leaned out of doorways. Women hushed their children. No one moved to stop him. Sheriff Pike wasn't in sight. His office door was shut, the window dark. Buck shook her so hard her teeth rattled. "Maybe I'll make you remember this day. A thief deserves a mark." His free hand darted for his pocket, where a matchbox clinked. Eliza's stomach dropped. Fire again. Always fire. She twisted, screamed, "No." And that was when Clayton Reeves stepped forward. Clayton's choice. He had been lighting a cigar on the corner, as he always did after tending to ranch business in town. The match flared, smoke curled, and for a heartbeat it was Samuel's face in the fire again, not Eliza's. Then Buck's voice cut through. "A thief deserves a mark." Clayton strode into the street, boots striking hard, his cigar unlit. "Her go." Buck sneered, not loosening his grip. "Well, if it ain't the cattle king himself, come to defend your property?" "She's no property of mine," Clayton said, low and sharp. "But you'll unhand her all the same." The crowd hushed. The wind carried grit across the road. Even the horses stamped less. Buck's grin widened. "What if I don't? You gonna puff smoke in my face, Reeves? Gonna buy me off with your silver dollars?" Clayton didn't blink. He reached into his vest, pulled out a coin, and tossed it. At Buck's boots, it rang against the dirt, shining in the sun. "There's your bread money. More than you deserve. Now walk away." For a moment, no one breathed. Buck looked from the coin to the girl, then to the crowd. He saw the sheriffs. Absence saw the eyes waiting, saw his own reflection in Clayton's steady stare. With a curse, he shoved Eliza down into the dust and snatched the coin. "Rot in hell, Reeves." He stormed off, muttering, the crowd parting quick to give him room. The question again. Clayton knelt beside Eliza, helping her to her feet. Her knees were scraped raw, palms bloody where she caught herself. He reached for his handkerchief, but she pulled back. Her eyes blazed at him, not with gratitude, but with something more complicated, something sharper. "You dropped your cigar," she said. Her voice shook, not from weakness, but from fury. Clayton looked down. Indeed, in the rush to confront Buck, the cigar had slipped from his hand. It lay in the dirt near her skirt hem, ember glowing faint and mean. Her lips trembled as she spoke again. "Are you going to put out the cigarette on me?" The street was silent. Men on the porch of the saloon leaned forward. Women in bonnets held their breath. The words rang louder than any church bell. Clayton stared at the ember. He thought of Samuel's barn, of fire-eating straw. He thought of Eliza's parents, burning inside their cabin. He thought of every match he'd struck, every puff of smoke. He'd exhaled like a dare to heaven. Slowly, he ground the cigar into the dirt with his boot. The hiss was soft, final. The crowd reacts whispers rippled. The cattle baron put out his smoke? Over a ragged orphan? Maybe the girl's cursed. Or maybe she's the only one bold enough to tell him the truth. Sheriff Pike appeared. Then, pushing through the crowd with his steady walk. His hand hovered near his holster, but he did not draw. His eyes scanned the scene, then settled on Clayton. "You all right, Eliza?" he asked. She nodded, though her hands still trembled. Amos's gaze shifted to Reeves, who stood tall but not proud, dust on his knees where he'd crouched beside the girl. "Good thing you were here," Amos said evenly. "Funny how trouble always finds its way to those who carry fire." Clayton didn't answer. His chest rose and fell, and his eyes never left the dark smear in the dirt where the cigar had died. A shift in the wind that night. When the sun fell and lanterns glowed in the windows, Dry Creek buzzed with talk. Some said Clayton had shown weakness, kneeling for a beggar girl. Others said they saw something different. Not weakness, but mercy. At the Reeves ranch. The bunkhouse hands whispered too, passing their tin mugs around. They'd seen their boss give up his cigar in front of everyone. A man who had ruled with smoke and fire had dropped it at the feet of an orphan. And in the silence of his own big house, Clayton sat at the table, his cigar box open but untouched. Eliza's words still clung to him like ash. "Are you going to put out the cigarette on me?" For the first time in 20 years, Clayton Reeves poured himself whiskey without lighting a match. The desert dusk was not gentle. It came sudden, a blade of shadow cutting the sun from the earth. In Dry Creek, lamps flickered to life in windows. The smell of beans and cornbread carried from doorways, and porch rockers slowed as families gathered close. But the saloon stayed alive, laughter and piano spilling into the street like whiskey from a cracked barrel. Clayton Reeves walked the main road alone. He had money enough to own a dozen streets like this, but never had the town. Felt so large, and himself so small. He hadn't lit a cigar since the afternoon with Buck Hanlon. His fingers itched for one, his mouth begged for the taste, yet something inside him recoiled no. The act that once felt powerful felt suddenly vile, and everywhere he turned, he caught whispers. Reeves dropped to his knees for a girl. Richest man in Dry Creek, undone by an orphan. Maybe she cursed him. Each word dug into him like a spur. But beneath the sting was something worse, something he didn't dare name. Yet, truth. The church steps. Eliza May sat on the steps of the church, her bread parcel beside her, a scrap of cloth in her lap. She was stitching a tear in her dress. neat and precise as ever. When Clayton approached, she did not look up. "You should be eating," he said. "I'll eat when I'm done," she replied, threading her needle without pause. "Clothes don't fix themselves." He shifted, unsure of his footing. A man who had ordered drovers, bargained with bankers, faced down outlaws, reduced to fumbling in front of a girl not yet grown. "Eliza," he began. "About today." Her hands stopped. The needle froze mid-her. Slowly, she lifted her gaze to his. "I don't need pity," she said. "I don't need coins tossed or bread bought for me. I just need folks to stop dropping fire at my feet." Clayton flinched. The word struck like the snap of a whip. "I didn't mean—" "You did," she cut in. "All of you do. Men in this town, rich or poor, don't see me until it's to laugh or shove or test their tempers. Are you different, Mr. Reeves? Or are you just another man with smoke in his lungs?" Her voice didn't tremble. That frightened him more than if she'd shouted. The knees in the dust. Clayton tried to hold her gaze, but the memories crashed in. Samuel's scream, the barn flames, the countless cigars lit over land deals while men starved around him. His wealth was built on ash. He had never faced it, not truly, until this girl forced him to. His legs buckled before he knew he'd moved. He dropped to his knees on the church steps, dust rising around him. Gasps carried from the boardwalk across the street. The saloon. Door swung as men leaned out to witness. "Forgive me," Clayton whispered, voice raw. His hat slipped from his head, falling into the dirt. "Forgive me for the smoke, for the fire, for the things I let burn and the things I never tried to save." Tears carved clean lines down his dust-caked cheeks. The cattle baron, who had ruled Dry Creek with swagger and silver, now knelt before an orphan girl. Eliza blinked, startled, then wary. "You're crying," she said flatly, as though testing if the sight was real. "I lost my brother in a fire." Clayton confessed, the words tumbling out after 20 years of silence. "My fault, my lantern. I left it burning. I thought if I smoked enough, if I breathed fire every day, maybe I could make it mine instead of his death. But it never worked. And when you asked me that question, I knew. I've been burning other people ever since." The street had gone silent. Even the piano had faltered, keys struck and left hanging. Eliza's choice. Eliza studied him. The needle still lay in her lap, thread dangling, forgotten. She saw the man's broad shoulders hunched, his hands trembling in the dirt, his fine clothes smeared with dust. For years she had dreamed of someone kneeling not in worship, but in recognition. Someone seeing her not as a nuisance or curse, but as a human being who had survived fire and loss. And here he was. But trust did not come easy. "Don't put out flames," she said quietly. Clayton lifted his head. "Then tell me what will. Tell me what I can do." Her eyes burned, not with anger now, but with something steadier. "Stop smoking. Stop carrying fire like it's your badge. Put out every last cigarette, not just the one by my feet. And if you mean to help me, don't make it charity. Make it right." The crowd stirred, murmurs running like wind in dry grass. No one in Dry Creek had ever dared tell Clayton Reeves what to do. He swallowed hard. His voice cracked, but his answer was clear. "Then it's done." He stood, reached into his coat, and pulled out his silver cigar case. The shine caught the last red of sunset. He looked at it once, then hurled it into the water trough. The hiss was sharp, final, as the cigars drowned. Eliza's lips parted. For the first time since they met, a flicker of belief crossed her face. A new beginning. Sheriff Amos Pike stepped forward then, his boots crunching in the dirt. His eyes swept the crowd, daring anyone to laugh. No one did. "You all saw?" Amos said. "A man can change if he chooses. Remember it." He turned to Eliza. And you? Girl, seems to me you've got more spine than half this town put together. You need work. You come to me. I'll see it's fair. Eliza nodded once, but her gaze stayed fixed on Clayton. Tomorrow, she sighed, I'll come to your ranch, not for handouts, to work. You treat me straight, I'll stay. You break your word, I'll walk. Clayton bowed his head. I'll earn it, Eliza May, every day. The piano struck up again inside the saloon. Tentative at first, then stronger. People drifted back to their business. Though the story would travel farther than cattle trails, by dawn Clayton picked up his hat from the dust. But before he set it back on his head, he glanced once more at the trough, where the drowned cigars floated like drowned sins. He felt lighter. Though the guilt was not gone, it never would be. But for the first time in decades, he felt something else, too. Hope. And as the orphan girl gathered her bread and her sewing, walking into the lengthening night, the richest man in Dry Creek followed a step behind. No smoke trailing him, only the faint smell of dust and redemption.